So with the iPhone 14 Pro and iPhone 14 Pro Max, Apple brought over that dynamic island, and they sold it as a revolutionary new app switcher, multitasking kind of taskbar, and also a place for your live activities to go with, but you can also interact with that actual dynamic island and get some additional features along with it. But from the feedback that I've received about this dynamic island, you're either in one of two camps. You either love it and you think it's great both from an aesthetic standpoint and a productivity standpoint, or B, you think it's useless, you think they should go back to the notch, you think it's too big, you think it's taking up too much space and even more screen real estate on the top of the actual iPhone itself compared to the 13 and below. So I thought to myself, what better way to actually distinguish whether it's a useful feature or a gimmick than to go through multiple situations and use the dynamic island on the 14 Pro Max and compare that in those same situations to a 13 Pro Max. So that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to go through multiple situations from AirPlay to volume rocker to phone calls to FaceTime and see exactly if that dynamic island adds any actual productivity value versus just an aesthetic kind of addition or something new on the new iPhone 14 Pro Max. And the last thing I'll say is that the main criteria that I look for something to add a little bit of value is if it gets you from point A to point B in a more efficient and quicker way. So by having the dynamic island there and being able to show notifications and live activities through there, is that adding any real value compared to the notch, which didn't really do that. So without further ado, let's compare the 13 Pro Max versus the 14 Pro Max and then the notch versus that dynamic island. Let's get into it. Okay everyone, let's get right into this video, and as you can see we have the 14 Pro Max right here, and then the 13 Pro Max from last year. We have the actual dynamic island up here. We have the notch, we're at 100% brightness. We're actually running 16.1 beta on both of them. So now that we have all that out of the way, let's see exactly all the different situations where the dynamic island and the notch will differ moving forward. First one we're gonna do is the ringer rocker. So if we do one of these, you can see that that goes into silent mode there. And if I do this, silent mode goes into the dynamic island. Again, we'll bring silent mode off. Silent mode off. That's the difference right there. So now let's hop into a focus mode. You can see that we have the midnight right there. And you can see that we have the do not disturb right there. So it is kind of in the way, and then you don't see that you're in the focus mode after the fact on the 13 Pro Max, but the 14 Pro Max, you can see that we are on that focus mode. Now let's do a Face ID unlock. So we're gonna lock both of these. Of course, you can see the always on display right there. So a little bit different, but nothing crazy. And now let's do Face ID for Apple Pay. So there was a difference right there. So now let's do a voice memo. On the 14 Pro Max, you can see that we actually have that right here with the actual live reader in the time. And then right here, you can see that we actually just have that like orangish yellow color on the top left corner. If we long press on here, you can actually stop it from there. If you long press on this, there's no action. It just brings you back to the application. We go in here and we stop. Now let's try a screen record. So we'll swipe down to the control center, press on screen record down here. And you can see the animation is already a little bit different. Up there, it shows you that we're screen recording. You get the red marker on the top left on the actual 13 Pro Max. If you long press on the island, if you long press on this, nothing happens. It just brings you to stop the actual screen recording, and then here to stop it, you can do that as well. We'll stop this. A little bit different there. Now let's open up a shortcut and let's see what that looks like. So we have this. So that drops down and then you get that right there. Let's try that again. A little less intrusive on the 14 Pro Max for sure. Now let's do maps. So if I open up Google Maps, let's go to, anywhere on here. Let's go here. Let's go here. Let's press start for directions. Swipe up. And you can see it is a little bit different. So you have the actual marker right here on the dynamic island to let you know that we are navigating. And if you long press on there, nothing happens. And then here on the top left corner, just like voice memos and screen recording, you get a blue hue over the actual timer on the top left of the 13 Pro Max. And if you click on that, it brings you to Google Maps. Click on this, it goes to Google Maps, and it works the same way with Apple Maps as well. Next one is live activities. So a good way to test this is with your timer. So if we go into a stopwatch, let me go down here, go into timer, we'll do 5 minutes and 7 minutes, we'll swipe up, and you can see the timer is showing on the dynamic island, and you can interact with it, long press, see the time. Here you actually have to swipe down to your control center to see that live activity. Still, you can interact with it, which is nice to see, but overall, it's a little bit easier to access with the dynamic island. Now let's do a music player. I personally use Spotify, so let's open up Spotify. We'll press play on both of these. So we're playing music right now. We swipe up, and obviously you can see that the music is playing on the dynamic island. And then here you can see you have to go to the control center to interact with the music, versus over here, if I go into Spotify and press play, I can just interact on the dynamic island right there. So to each their own, it does require the same amount of steps, but one is prettier than the other, in my opinion. So now let's see how FaceTime comes in. As you can see, same idea. And the next thing I do want to look at is, first off, you can see that my microphone is muted, so that's a new little feature which I didn't know even existed. But if we go in here, we can actually screen share. These are the apps to share my screen, so we can apps for share play, which is nice to have. So share my screen, 3, 2, 1. See what that looks like. Swipe up, and you can see that that's what it looks like when I'm sharing my screen. And if I switch over here, let's see what screen sharing looks like right there. So share my screen, give it a second. Swipe up, and then that's what screen sharing looks like on the 13 Pro Max. A little bit different, but the same idea applies. Now to show you what it looks like when you swipe away, you can see that it's still an incoming call right there on the dynamic island. If I swipe away here, it shows that it's still an incoming call, but on the top left-hand corner. So that seems to be the running theme. For most situations, whatever shows up on the dynamic island will show up on the top left corner of a 13 Pro Max and older. So now let's see what it's like to charge these devices. So that's the 14 Pro Max. Same idea, but as you saw, dynamic island, it showed up in there first. And then if we go into low power mode, nothing really changes from the dynamic island perspective. So now let's see what Airdrop looks like. So it does show up on the dynamic island versus on the 13 Pro Max. Nothing really happens, but again, that's something to take a note of. And now we have the same video playing on YouTube. We have the 14 Pro Max on this side, 13 on this side. Let's zoom in and pinch in. You can see that the dynamic island actually comes in a little bit more. It comes a little farther down. Even though we do have that sliver right there versus the notch, it does take up a more complete section, but overall it doesn't come down as much. So again, it's probably personal preference at this point, but just something to shout out. So that is going to do it for this video, everybody. Like you saw, there are some instances where the dynamic island adds a little bit more value in terms of being able to go directly into an application or being able to maybe interact with something like a live activity and a timer, where it does shorten your process from going to point A to point B and reduces the friction, and you actually alleviate a certain step than going to the 13 Pro Max and the notch. But again, that's totally up to you whether that's actually a value proposition for you and whether that's worth $1,100 or $1,000 going from a 13 Pro or a 13 Pro Max to these new 14 Pro and 14 Pro Max. I personally think the dynamic island is more on the cool side than on the productivity side, but at the end of the day, just because Apple added something doesn't mean it needs to provide an immense amount of value. It could just be added on there because it's aesthetically pleasing, it looks cool, because again, not everything that comes out and is released and needs to, change the world and needs to really make your life that much easier. It could just be there because it's cool at the end of the day. But that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully you guys got some insight as to whether or not that dynamic island is really useful for yourself in your use cases versus something like the classic notch that we've had since the iPhone 10. But that's going to do it for this video. If you guys did enjoy, leave a little dolphin in the comments down below so I know that you guys made it to the very end of the video, and also leave some comments down below if you guys upgraded to the 14 Pro and Pro Max, if you're using that dynamic island, and what you guys think about it overall. Always very curious. But if you guys want to watch some more videos on iOS, macOS, and iPadOS, click on one of these videos right here. And until next time, I'm Fernando, and I'm out of here. Peace.